This episode looks at the macabre exploits of 19th century American serial killer Herman Mudgett, who went by the alias of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and was one of the first serial killers in the country to be caught and prosecuted. A remarkably effective con artist, Holmes, by the time he was finally apprehended, had engaged in a lengthy criminal career that included insurance fraud, forgery, swindling, 3 or 4 bigamist marriages, horse theft, and murder.
I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing.
He was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, but later assumed the alias of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H. H. Holmes. He came from a fairly well-off family and was said to be fairly intelligent from an early age, expressing an interest in the medical profession. Even so, there were haunting signs of what was to come. His parents were both devout Methodists, and his father was a farmer and a trader of agricultural products. It was rumoured that he was also a heavy drinker who cruelly mistreated his family. At a young age, Holmes faced bullying by classmates due to his academic skills. In one incident, he was forced to stand in front of a human skeleton and put its hands on his face in an effort to frighten him. Initially terrified, he later realized that the experience was intriguing to him and claimed it helped overcome his worries. He subsequently developed an obsession with death as a result of this encounter and became preoccupied with dissecting dead animals. In July 1878, he married Clara Lovering in Alton, New Hampshire. They had one son, Robert Mudgett. Neighbours later recalled that Holmes was physically violent towards Clara, and in 1884 she had had enough and moved back to New Hampshire, having little contact with him after that. A couple of years earlier, in 1882, he attended the University of Michigan at the Department of Medicine and Surgery, graduating 2 years later. Holmes's life of crime began with various frauds and scams. While there, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William Herdman, who was the chief lecturer. The two were rumoured to have been engaged in facilitating grave robbing to supply bodies for dissection, but nothing was proved. Years later, Holmes admitted to using cadavers to defraud life insurance companies several times during his time as a student. He travelled to Philadelphia and was hired by a pharmacy, but while he was working there, a boy died after taking medicine that was purchased at the store. Holmes denied any involvement in the child's death and immediately left the city, moving to Chicago in August 1886. It was then he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid the possibility of being exposed by victims of his previous scams. Soon after his arrival, he was employed in a pharmacy in the Englewood area of the city, owned by Elizabeth Holton, and he proved to be a hard-working employee, eventually buying the business. His acquisition of the shop was questioned years later, as it was suggested he had killed his employer and forged the sale paperwork in order to get his hands on it. Nothing was ever proved. Later that year, while still legally married to Clara, Holmes married 24-year-old Myrta Belknap. He filed for divorce from Clara a few weeks after marrying Myrta. The divorce suit went nowhere and was never finalized. Holmes had one daughter with Myrta called Lucy, who was born in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. Holmes lived with Myrta and Lucy in Wilmette, Illinois, and spent most of his time in Chicago, tending to business. In May 1893, he represented his mistress, Wilhelmina Williams, as his wife. In a court case, he married Georgina Yoke in January the 17th, 1884, in Denver, while still married to both Clara and Myrta. The pharmacy continued to do well, and the profits enabled Holmes to buy an empty plot of land across the street, where construction began in 1887 for a two-story mixed-use building, with flats on the first floor and retail spaces, including a new chemist shop, on the ground floor. When in 1888, Holmes failed to pay the architects or the steel company, they took him to court. In 1892, he added another floor to the building, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World Exposition. Contemporary accounts had the idea that Holmes built the hotel to lure tourists in order to kill them and sell their skeletons to nearby medical schools. Although he did have a history of selling stolen bodies, he had acquired them through grave robbing rather than murder. Likewise, there was no evidence that Holmes ever murdered exposition goers on the premises. The newspapers dubbed the building as Holmes' Murder Castle, claiming the structure contained secret torture chambers, trapdoors, and a basement crematorium. None of these sensationalized claims were true. Holmes' probable first victims were Julia Connor, the wife of a man who worked in his chemist shop, and her daughter Pearl, who were last seen alive just before Christmas 1891. Around that time, Holmes paid a local man to remove the skin from the corpse of an unusually tall woman. Julia stood nearly 6 feet tall and articulate the skeleton for sale to a medical school. No visible clues to the deceased identity would have remained. Holmes met and became close friends with 38-year-old Benjamin Peasel, a carpenter who had a criminal past. Holmes used him as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes, with insurance companies pressing to prosecute him for arson. Holmes left Chicago in July 1894 and reappeared in Fort Worth, where he had inherited property. Here he once again attempted to build an incomplete structure without paying his suppliers or contractors. He was arrested and briefly jailed for the first time on a charge of selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis. He was promptly bailed out, but while in jail he struck up a conversation with a convicted villain called Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. He promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. He was directed to a St. Louis attorney named Howe, who thought Holmes's scheme was brilliant and agreed to play a part. The plan to fake his own death failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press the claim and instead concocted a similar plan with his accomplice Peitzel, who agreed to fake his own death so that his wife could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy, which he was to split with Holmes and Howe. The plan, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Peitzel to set himself up as an investor under the name of B.F. Perry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Peitzel. Instead, Holmes killed Peitzel on September the 4th by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire. Forensic evidence presented at Holmes's later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Peitzel's death, a fact of which the insurance company was unaware, presumably to stage a suicide to exonerate Holmes should he be charged with murder. Holmes collected the insurance payout on the basis of the genuine Peitzel corpse and went on to manipulate Peitzel's unsuspecting wife, Carrie. into allowing 3 of her 5 children to be placed in his care. The 3 children were 13-year-old Alice Peetzel, 9-year-old Nellie Peetzel, and 7-year-old Howard Peetzel. Holmes and the 3 Peetzel children travelled throughout the northeastern United States and into Canada. Carrie travelled along a parallel route, all the time using various aliases. Holmes lied to Carrie about her husband's death by claiming that he was hiding in London, as well as lying to her about the true whereabouts of her 3 missing children. In Detroit, just before crossing the border into Canada, they were separated only by a few blocks. In an even more audacious move, Holmes was staying at another location with his current wife, who was unaware of the whole affair. He later confessed to murdering Alice and Nellie on October the 25th, 1894, by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He drilled a hole in the lid and put one end of the hose through the hole, attaching the other end to a gas pipe to asphyxiate them. He buried their bodies in the cellar of his rented house at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto. Frank Geyer was a Philadelphia Police Department detective assigned to investigate Holmes and find the 3 missing children. Geyer began in June 1894 to trace Holmes's steps and found the decomposed bodies of the 2 Peetzel girls in the cellar of the Toronto home. He wrote that, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the smell became. And when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." Geyer discovered unsent letters written by the Peetzel children that Holmes had kept. This information led to further investigation of Holmes's Chicago property, and ultimately led Geyer to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a house. He was reported to have visited a local pharmacy to purchase the drugs which he had used to kill the son, Howard Peetzel, on October the 10th, 1884, and a repair shop to sharpen the knives he used to chop up the body before he burned it. The boy's bones were discovered hidden in the house's chimney. His murder spree finally ended after outrunning the authorities when he was arrested in Boston on November the 17th, after being tracked there from Philadelphia by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft and fraud in Texas because the authorities had become more suspicious at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting 3rd wife. Authorities initially thought he was simply a prolific and gifted swindler, but they soon uncovered evidence linking Holmes to the murder of longtime business associate Benjamin Peetzel in Philadelphia. In July the following year, after the discovery of Alice and Nellie's bodies, Chicago police and reporters began investigating Holmes's building in Chicago, now locally referred to as the Murder Castle. Though many sensational claims were made, no evidence was found which could have convicted Holmes, as there was only very circumstantial evidence of any castle victims. Holmes was tried for the murder of Peetzel in Philadelphia, which had the clearest case for murder, and was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of his accomplice in several of his cons, and he confessed to 27 murders and 6 attempted murders, including those of some people who were verifiably still alive. It is known that he killed 3 of Peetzel's children, as well as 3 mistresses, the child of one mistress and the sister of another. 8 months later, on May the 7th, he was executed, aged 34, in front of a crowd at the city's prison. Until the moment of his death, he remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. He asked for his pine coffin to be contained in concrete and buried 10 feet deep, because he was concerned grave robbers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Holmes's neck did not break. He instead strangled to death, slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. Holmes gave various contradictory accounts of his life, initially claiming innocence, and later that he was possessed by the devil. His propensity for lying has made it difficult for researchers to ascertain the truth on the basis of his statements. For example, he claimed that Dr. Robert Laycock, a fellow medical school classmate, was one of his first murder victims, and that he killed him in 1886 for insurance money. It turns out that Laycock died on October 5th, 1889, in Watford, Ontario. Some accounts said the hotel was made up of over 100 rooms and laid out like a maze, with doors opening onto brick walls, windowless rooms, and dead-end staircases. In reality, the third-floor hotel was moderately sized, largely unremarkable and uncompleted due to Holmes's dispute with the builders. It was suggested, when he added the floor onto his building, he told people it was going to be a hotel space, but it was never finished or furnished or open to the public. The whole thing was just a vehicle to swindle suppliers and investors and insurers. To furnish his building, Holmes bought items on credit and hid them whenever creditors came calling. On one occasion, workers from a local furniture company arrived to repossess its property, only to find the building empty. A caretaker bribed by Holmes eventually revealed that he had moved all of his furnishings into a single room and walled up its door to avoid detection. It did contain some hidden rooms, but they were used for hiding furniture Holmes had bought on credit and did not intend to pay for. In his confession, he stated that his usual method of killing was to suffocate his victims using various means, including an overdose of chloroform, overexposure to gas fumes, or trapping them in an airless vault. He also claimed to have used starvation and to have burnt victims alive in his castle. He also owned a one-story factory, which he claimed was to be used for glass manufacture. It is unclear if the factory furnace was ever used for this purpose, and it was speculated to have been used to destroy incriminating evidence of his crimes. On New Year's Eve, 1909, Hedgepeth, who had been pardoned for informing on Holmes, was shot and killed by police officer Edward Jaberek during a hold-up at a Chicago bar. On March 7, 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported that, with the death of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, that the mysteries would remain unexplained. Quinlan had committed suicide by taking strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep." His surviving relatives claimed he had been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. The Holmes castle itself was damaged by a fire in August 1895, shortly after his arrest. Two men, presumed to be arsonists, were seen entering the back of the building at 9 p.m. About half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away as the fire erupted. Following several explosions, the building went up in flames. It survived and was repaired and restored, remaining in use as a post office until it was demolished in 1938. The site is currently occupied by the Englewood branch of the United States Postal Service. Holmes is widely considered the United States' first known serial killer. He confessed to 27 murders, although some speculative estimates put it as high as 200, including those of some people who are verifiably still alive. In the killer's own words, I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing. In 2017, during allegations Holmes had escaped execution, his body was exhumed for testing, led by the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Due to his coffin being contained in concrete, his body was found not to have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his moustache was found to be intact. The body was positively identified as being that of Holmes.